Hello, everyone. My name is John Sierra, and I am a Tolkien Scholar. And what that basically means is that I study the works of J.R.R. Tolkien and can generally answer any of your questions about his works, whether it's The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings or the Silmarillion or anything he's written or done or said or anything like that. So welcome to the channel. This is the first episode that I'm actually recording in 2025. Of course, you guys have probably already seen an episode come out, but I am recording this in 2025, so Happy New Year to all of you guys, and there we have it. Channel update real quick. I was like, have we reached 2,000 subs? And I was kind of thinking in my head, like, probably not. Probably not. I probably got a ways to go still, and I looked at it, and we're so close. It was actually like, oh, wow, we're 3 away. Maybe by the time this goes live, well, definitely by the time it goes live next week, but I mean by the time that I put it up for members, we'll hit 2,000 subscribers, and then we're going to start doing streams on YouTube and stuff like that, so it's going to be really cool and a lot of fun. There's some setup on my end and everything, so it isn't going to be like instantly, but it's going to be very, very, very soon, so there is that. So I have 12 questions to get through today. We've been sort of like going through this process of figuring out how many questions I should aim for answering. I used to do around 15 to 20. But then recently, when I had, the Christmas holiday was happening, and I did an episode that was a little bit, well, it wasn't shorter because I talked longer in each segment, but it was shorter in terms of number of questions. It was only 10. And it wasn't because I didn't have the time to, do a longer video with more questions, but it was because I didn't have the time to do all the researching and answering of those questions. So I basically only answered the ones that I got to. And I think it kind of worked out. And then the next week after that was, New Year's Eve, and it was sort of a similar situation. I think it was around 11 or 12 questions. And I did ask you guys, do you like it when there's less questions but more talking in more detail, or do you like it when there's more questions and it's shorter segments, or a mixture of both? And, I only got a few answers to that so far because that video where I asked that so far is members only. It goes up tomorrow, as in tomorrow, the day after I'm recording this, for everybody else. So I'll get more answers. But so far, it seems to be people either asking for less questions with more talking in detail, or a mixture of both, which like I said, I haven't decided exactly how it's going to work, and it might change. It might be some weeks I do less questions and some weeks I do more questions. But I used to try to hit an arbitrary goal, and I just think that it's better to just do it more naturally and just see how many I get to in that week instead of trying to strive for a goal, because the videos wind up being around the same length anyway. So, like I said, we're currently 3 away from 2,000 as of recording this, and we may have hit 2,000 by the time I edit it. I don't know, but we'll see. But subscribe if you enjoy the content. I'm going to ask again at the end of the stream. The end of the, I was just streaming. The end of the video. Anyway, we're going to do a reading from the Silmarillion, and I've chosen the chapter of the flight of the Noldor, where the first kinslaying happened. And, in the most recent episode of the Council of Tolkien, we talked about this. Me and Sid specifically went back and forth a little bit about this. But I wanted to read out this whole part where Feanor is sort of making this decision to go ahead and go to Middle-earth, even though he has been told not to do this. At length, after the long debate... Let's try that again. Here we go. At length, after long debate, Feanor prevailed, and the greater part of the Noldor, there assembled, he set aflame with the desire of new things and strange countries. Therefore with Finarfin spoke yet again for heed and delay. A great shout went up, Nay, let us be gone. And straightway Feanor and his sons began to prepare for the marching forth. Little foresight could there be for those who dare to take so dark a road. Yet all was done in overhaste, for Feanor drove them on, fearing lest in the cooling of their hearts his words should wane, and other counsels yet prevail. And for all his proud words he did not forget the power of the Valar. But from Valmar no message came, and Manwe was silent. He would not yet either forbid or hinder Feanor's purpose, for the Valar were aggrieved that they were charged with evil intent to the Eldar, or that they were held captive by them against their will. Now they watched and waited, for they did not yet believe that Feanor could hold the host of the Noldor to his will. And indeed, when Feanor began the marshalling of the Noldor for their setting out, then at once dissension arose. For though he had brought the assembly to mind to depart, by no means were all a mind to take Feanor as king. Greater love was given to Fingolfin and his sons, and his household, and the most part of the dwellers in Tirion refused to renounce him, if they would go with him. And thus at the last, as two divided hosts, the Noldor set forth upon their bitter road. Feanor and his following were in the van, but the greater host came behind under Fingolfin. And he marched against his wisdom, because Fingon his son so urged him, and because he would not be sundered from his people that were eager to go, nor leave them to the rash counsels of Feanor. Nor did he forget his words before the throne of Manwe. With Fingolfin went Finarfin also, and for like reasons, but most loath was he to depart. And for all the Noldor in Valinor, who were grown now to a great people, but one tithe refused to take the road, some for the love that they bore to the Valar, and to Aule not least, some for the love of Tirion and the many things that they had made, none for fear of peril by the way. But even as the trumpet sang, and Feanor issued from the gates of Tirion, a messenger came at last from Manwe, saying, Against the folly of Feanor shall be set my counsel only. Go not forth, for the hour is evil, and your road leads to sorrow that ye do not perceive. No aid will the Valar lend you in this quest, but neither will they hinder you. For this ye shall know, as ye come hither freely, freely shall ye depart. But thou, Feanor, Finwë's son, by thine oath art exiled. The lies of Melkor thou shalt unlearn in bitterness. Vala he is, thou sayest. Then thou hast sworn in vain, for none of the Valar canst thou overcome now or ever within the halls of Ea. Not through Eru, whom thou namest, has made thee thrice greater than thou art. But Feanor laughed, and spoke not to the herald, but to the Noldor, saying, So, then with these valiant people send forth the heir of their king alone into banishment with his sons only, and return to their bondage? But if any will come with me, I say to them, Is sorrow foreboded to you? But in Aemon we have seen it, in Aemon we have come through bliss to woe. The other now we will try, through sorrow to find joy or freedom at the least. Then turning the herald he cried, Say this to Manwe Sulim, O High King of Arda, if Feanor cannot overthrow Morgoth, or at least delays not to assail him, and sits not idle in grief. And it may be that Eru has set in me a fire greater than thou knowest. Such hurt at the least I will do for the foe of the Valar, that even the mighty in the ring of doom shall wonder to hear it. Yea, in the end they shall follow me. Farewell. In that hour the voice of Feanor grew so great and so potent, that even the herald of the Valar bowed before him as one full answered and departed, and the Noldor were overruled. Therefore they continued their march, and the house of Feanor hastened before them along the coasts of Elenda. Not once did they turn their eyes back to Tirion on the green hills of Tuna. Slower and less eagerly came the hosts of Fingolfin after them. Of those Fingon was the foremost, but at the rear went Finarfin and Finrod, and many of the noblest and wisest of the Noldor, and often they looked behind them to see their fair city, until the lamp of the Mindan Aldelieva was lost in the night. More than any others, the exiles, they carried them memories of the bliss they had forsaken, and some even of things they had made there that they took with them, a solace and a burden on the road. Now Feanor led the Noldor northward, because his first purpose was to follow Morgoth. Moreover, Tuna, beneath Teniquetil, was set nigh to the girdle of Arda, and there the great sea was immeasurably wide, whereas ever northward the sundering seas grew narrower, as the waste land of Ahriman and the coasts of Middle-earth drew together. But as the mind of Feanor cooled and took counsel, he perceived overlate that all these great companies would never overcome the long leagues to the north, nor cross the seas at the least, save with the aid of ships. Yet it would need long time and toil to build so great a fleet, even were there any among the Noldor skilled in that craft. He resolved now, therefore, to persuade the Teleri, ever friends of the Noldor, to join with them, and in his rebellion he thought that the bliss of Valinor might be further diminished, and his power for war upon Morgoth be increased. He hastened them to Alqualonde, and spoke to the Teleri as he had spoken before in Tirion. But the Teleri were unmoved by aught that he could say. They were grieved indeed at the going of their kinsfolk as long friends, but would rather dissuade them than aid them, and no ship would they lend, nor help in the building against the will of the Valar. As for themselves, they desired now no other home but the strands of Eldamar, and no other lord than Olwe, prince of Alqualonde. And he had never lent ear to Morgoth, nor welcomed him in his land, and he trusted still that Ulmo and the great among the Valar would redress the hurts of Morgoth, and that the night would pass yet to a new dawn. Then Feanor grew wrathful, for he still feared delay, and hotly he spoke to Olwe. "You renounce your friendship even in the hour of our need," he said. "Yet you were glad indeed to receive our aid, when you came at last to these shores, faint-hearted loiterers, and well-nigh empty-handed. In huts on the beaches would you be dwelling still had not the Noldor carved out your haven and toiled upon your walls." But Olwe answered, "We renounce no friendship, but it may be the part of a friend to rebuke a friend's folly. And when the Noldor welcomed us and gave us aid, otherwise than you spoke, in the land of Aemon we were to dwell forever, as brothers whose houses stand side by side. But as for our white ships, those you gave us not. We learned not that craft from the Noldor, but from the lords of the sea. And the white timbers we wrought with our own hands, and the white sails were woven by our wives and our daughters. Therefore we will neither give them nor sell them for any league or friendship. For I say to you, Feanor, son of Finwë, that these are to us as the gems of the Noldor, the work of our hearts, whose like we shall not make again." And thereupon Feanor left him, and sat in dark thought beyond the walls of Alqualonde until his host was assembled. When he judged that his strength was enough, he went to the haven of the swans, and began to man the ships that were anchored here, and to take them away by force. But the Teleri withstood him, and cast many of the Noldor into the sea. Then swords were drawn, and a bitter fight was fought among the ships, and about the lamplit quays and piers of the haven, and even upon the great arch of its gate. Thrice the people of Feanor were driven back, and many were slain upon either side. But the vanguard of the Noldor was succoured by Fingon, with the foremost of the host of Fingolfin, who coming up found a battle joined, and their own kin falling, and rushed in before they knew rightly the cause of the quarrel. Some thought indeed that the Teleri had sought to waylay the march of the Noldor, at the bidding of the Valar. Thus, at last the Teleri were overcome, and a great part of their mariners that dwelt in Alqualonde were wickedly slain. For the Noldor were become fierce and desperate, and the Teleri had less strength, and were armed for the most part with slender bows. Then the Noldor drew away their white ships, and manned their oars as best they might, and rowed them north along the coast. And Olwe called upon Osse, but he came not, for it was not permitted by the Valar that the flight of the Noldor should be hindered by force. But Uinen wept for the mariners of the Teleri, and the sea rose in wrath against the slayers, so that many of the ships were wrecked, and those in them drowned. Of the kinslaying in Alqualonde more is told, that lament which is named Nodolanta, the fall of the Noldor that Maglor made ere he lost. So there's a few things to touch on here. It is often repeated by people on Quora, especially in comment sections, that the first kinslaying, which you just heard of the first kinslaying, was perpetrated not by the Noldor, but by the Teleri, or the Falmari, as they're sometimes called, because these are a specific tribe of Teleri. And this is untrue, as you've seen. And the word that often gets used is drowned. That they drowned the Noldor, that they started fighting to protect the ships, which is a form of self-defense, to protect your own property, and that they drowned the Noldor. But note that Tolkien doesn't actually say that. What he says is that they were cast into the sea. He does use the word drowned when speaking of the ships being destroyed with some of the Noldor on them, not by the Teleri, but by Uinen. And what's interesting is that the Teleri called upon Osse. And Osse has a really interesting history because he was a little bit like Sauron in a way, that he was seduced into the Dark Lord Morgoth's service because Osse, he is the bringer of storms. And he is the one that likes to wreck things, And with Morgoth, he saw there a way of unleashing himself more fully and reveling in his own nature, just as Sauron did, just as many did, But what we see here is that Osse doesn't come because the Valar have said we cannot stop them by force. And then Uinen, which is Osse's wife, and the one that brought him back to the side of good, is the one that winds up wrecking the ships, not out of her wrath and purposeful destruction, but out of her tears that she could not control because she was so aggrieved by the kinslaying, which is a little bit more understanding. And this we get a true look into the power of a Maya when they are fully unleashed, that just the act of weeping could be destructive. And this is why the War of Wrath was so destructive. And this is why they say, well, why didn't Tolkien walk into Middle-earth and grab Sauron in the Third Age? Or why didn't they send Ianwe or something? When you really unleash these guys, they're so destructive that it harms the land. And they have already harmed the land enough in the long ages before this. So that's interesting. Yes, there were Noldor that were drowned. No, it was not by the Teleri or Falmari. It was by Uinen, and not even really on purpose. She didn't set out to say, I'm going to drown some of these guys. She was upset, and something happened. Because she's powerful. She's like Osse. Because it was actually, Osse and Uinen, they are Maya of the Vala Ulmo, who is sort of like the Poseidon of Tolkien's legendarium. He's not a god like Poseidon is, but he is part of a pantheon of greater angels, and he is associated with the sea and waters and such. And then, of course, we have Osse, who is his guy that's associated specifically with storms. And Osse goes off to be with Melkor, Morgoth. And it's actually Aule who says, here's how we get him back. We send Uinen after him, and they're going to fall in love, and that's going to save him. And that is what happened. And they welcomed back Osse with open arms and forgiveness. But this is why I get so kind of irritated at people who say, oh, the Teleri started it. They didn't start it. They didn't want their ships to be taken. For varying reasons, as you saw there. They didn't want to go against the will of the Valar. They didn't want their ships used for evil. And yes, they had created them, and it was a craft of their own, which was the point that Sid was making. But it's interesting to note that this is only brought up after Feanor gives this sort of rather jerky speech where he says, everything you have is because of us. We built your houses, and we did everything for you, so the least you could do is give us your ships. And he's saying, well, you didn't give us the ships. And that's sort of the idea there, like that you had no part of that. That's all us, And I think that it wasn't so much that they were being selfish. I think that the Teleri here are saying to Feanor, losing the ships would be like you losing the Silmarils for us, because they want to get through to him. Because they do consider him a good friend. And the most important line here, Tolkien understood this, and a lot of people in our modern age understand this, but not enough people. But it may be the part of a friend to rebuke a friend's folly. Sometimes friends have to tell you that you're wrong. Not in an unkind way, but to help you. And here, Feanor, he knows that he's running hot. I mean, he was ready to dash across the Helcaraxa until he finally cooled down at least a little bit. Probably won't work out so well. We'll take ships. Another thing that is repeated that is untrue, this is the last thing I want to address here, is that many times I have pointed out that Fingolfin did not take part in the kinslaying. And people will say, well, you're wrong, because he came upon the host and the battle was happening and he didn't know what was happening. He thought they were being attacked, so he joined in. So he did take part in the kinslaying. That's not true. Notice that it did not say Fingolfin, it said Fingon. They're two different people. I know the first 6 letters of their names are the same, Fingon, Fingolf, and, well, first 5 letters. Different people. I get this all the time when I say Fingolfin did not take part in the kinslaying, or Galadriel did not take part in the kinslaying. It is said that the host at the front of Fingolfin's company, which was a lot larger than Feanor's company, most of the Noldor went with Fingolfin, not Feanor. Because even though they agreed with what he was saying, they didn't want him as their king. They wanted Fingolfin, which is understandable because Fingolfin's a reasonable person. And he's only going on this because he doesn't want any of his people to be under Feanor's insane sort of reign there. He has to look after them. He's feeling obligated to do this. And of course it leads to a whole lot of kin strife and 2 more kinslayings and all the sorrows that they said. And note here that the Valar didn't say you can't go to Middle-earth. They said you came here freely, you can leave freely. But Feanor, you can't come back. They didn't all get exiled at this point. It was only him. And what's interesting is that he immediately throws his sons under the bus. They tell him, Feanor, you're exiled for the things that you've said and done. And he says, so I'm just supposed to go and be exiled with my sons? And I would imagine that maybe some of his sons are like, whoa, hold on. They didn't say we were exiled. They're talking about you. But of course, they were loyal to their father and they followed him and they had taken the oath with him. And they did terrible things in his name. All of them, even the best of them did terrible things in their father's name. So it's really interesting to see that he sort of like immediately assumes that they're an extension of him in a way, and he treated his sons like they were an extension of him, and they treated themselves like they were extensions of him to their doom, to the bitter end, as they would say. And when they all became exiles is because of the kinslaying. Because they spilled blood. A point that I had made is that the reason that the Noldor won this is because they were the ones with the weapons, and Sid was like, well, no, the Teleri had said weapons. I said they had bows for hunting. They didn't have weapons of war. The Noldor were the warlike race. They were the ones that made armor. They were the ones that made swords. You don't use swords for hunting. I mean, I guess you can, but you shouldn't. That's not what they're designed for. Swords are weapons of war. They're not tools of hunting. A bow is a tool of hunting. That's why people say in The Lord of the Rings, when I point out that Aragorn had a sword, but it was broken, he didn't really have a sword. And people will say, well, he had to have something to hunt with, right? No, he probably did have hunting tools and hunting weapons. He probably made snares and things like that, but he didn't have a sword. A sword is not a hunting weapon. I guess, like I said, if a deer or a boar runs straight at you, perhaps you could kill it with a sword. But there's a reason we don't use weapons like that for hunting, because not only do you have to get right up close with it, but it probably, like I would imagine, ruins the meat, whereas an arrow, it doesn't as much, Anyway, we're going to get to your questions. So here we go. Let's start with your first question. Our first question was an anonymous submission. Was Sam actually more equipped to carry the ring since he was able to give it back to Frodo, who later resisted destroying it in the fire? Perhaps he was, perhaps he was not. But it is beside the point of the story. It doesn't matter. One could argue that any number of characters may have been better suited to carry the ring to Mount Doom than Frodo Baggins was. You could argue, for example, that Gimli might have been better suited for the role. But it doesn't matter because the job wasn't appointed to Frodo. He volunteered for it, at least that's the way that it seemed. At the Council of Elrond, a great deal was made about what the One Ring is, what it is capable of, and what should be done about it. At this point, only 2 people in the room were willing to take possession of the ring. The first was Boromir, But he didn't wish to take it to Mount Doom. He wished to take it to Minas Tirith and either use it against Sauron somehow, and then after he was told that that was impossible, to keep it safe from Sauron. And that was not going to be allowed. The next person was Bilbo, who thought it was his obligation to take the ring to Mount Doom. And I'm going to read you a brief snippet from the Fellowship of the Ring. Very well, Master Elrond, said Bilbo suddenly. Say no more. It is plain enough what you are pointing at. Bilbo the silly hobbit started this affair, and Bilbo had better finish it, or himself. I was very comfortable here and getting on with my book. If you want to know, I'm just writing an ending for it. I had thought of putting, and he lived ever afterward to the end, happily ever afterward to the end of his days. It is a good ending, and none the worse for having been used before. Now I shall have to alter that. It does not look like it's coming true, and anyway, there is evidently have to be several more chapters if I live to write them. It is a frightful nuisance. When ought I to start? So the reaction to Bilbo volunteering varied. Boromir actually started to laugh a little bit. But then he read the room, and he stopped himself. Bilbo was very well respected in this room. Gloin smiled. His old friend had not changed very much. Gandalf told Bilbo that it's unfair to blame himself for starting this mess. The blame was not with him, but with Sauron, not Bilbo. So he also was too old and already had spent far too much time with the One Ring. So Gandalf told him, relax and get ready to write a sequel to the book. So then Bilbo wonders out loud, if not myself, then who? Who is going to take this trek to Mordor? And the room gets very quiet. No one spoke. No one stood up. It wasn't like the movie where they all started arguing. They were all very quiet. Sam didn't speak up. Gimli didn't speak up. They didn't jump off their seats and proclaim themselves the heroes. But rather it was Frodo who eventually spoke up. And I'm going to read you that passage. No one answered. The noon bell rang. Still no one spoke. Frodo glanced at all the faces, but they were not turned to him. All the council sat with downcast eyes as if in deep thought. A great dread fell on him, as if he were awaiting the pronouncement of some doom that he had long foreseen and vainly hoped might after all never be spoken. An overwhelming longing to rest and remain in peace by Bilbo's side in Rivendell filled all his heart. At last, with an effort, he spoke, and wondered to hear his own words, as if some other will was using his small voice. I will take the ring, he said, though I do not know the way. So at this point, it doesn't matter that perhaps Sam would have resisted the will of the ring in the end more than Frodo did. Yes, he gave it back to Frodo with only a very small bit of reluctance, but he had not been carrying it for 18 years. Yes, Tolkien said that Sam was the chief hero of the story, but Frodo was the ring bearer. That is the way he wrote it. Sam is the chief hero, Frodo's the ring bearer. And he's the ring bearer because he spoke up. Now you may ask yourself why. Frodo was like Bilbo in many ways, but he lacked the tookish wanderlust. He loved the Shire, and he did not wish to depart it, and he only did so having found himself in grave danger, and not wishing to bring those in the Shire into this danger. He wished to travel to Rivendell, lie low for a little while, and then eventually, hopefully, be able to return home if it was safe to do so. Instead, here he is suddenly volunteering to simply walk into Mordor. The words that clue us in are as if some other will was using his small voice. We see a similar thing happen at the end of Frodo's journey to Mordor. While he's in Mordor, close to his goal, but lying there exhausted, suddenly he gets up, as does Samwise, and they're suddenly energized by a sudden urge to continue, a call from beyond. And that it had to be right then. It was now or never. Now, some people lament the usage of divine intervention in The Lord of the Rings at the very end. Tolkien's assertion that it was Ilúvatar, God himself, that made sure that Gollum and the One Ring slipped into the fire. And I say these sort of people, they're a surly sort. They're angry for having the rug pulled out from under them. that the heroes got that far only for God to finish the job for them. What they fail to realize is that he was there all along. Tolkien spoke of Ilúvatar's place in The Lord of the Rings as the being who is always present, yet never named. The One Ring was meant to leave Gollum and be found by Bilbo. It was meant to pass to Frodo. Frodo was meant to volunteer, and he must get it there. No one, not Frodo, not Sam, not Gimli, not Gandalf, could have destroyed it willingly. Gollum had a part to play. The seeds were sown far back in the early days of the Silmarillion. Elrond, who was later called Gandalf, was a student of several of the Valar, but he was most fond of Nienna. Nienna taught him the virtues of patience, pity, and mercy. It is only through these virtues that Gollum is present at the end. Everyone was patient with him, everyone pitied him, and he was spared, given mercy, time and time again, even when he deserved death. Frodo had every opportunity to rid himself of Gollum, even to just leave him tied up. He learned this from Gandalf, who learned it from Nienna. We see so many small little events, tiny little eucatastrophes in The Lord of the Rings, bits where Ilúvatar's hand guides everything towards a certain goal. This does not make the quest pointless. It's the only reason that there's a point at all. For without this, might would win. The fact that such an insane gambit would pay off at all was only on the faith of Gandalf. Frodo was not appointed by Gandalf or Elrond or any of the wise elf lords or powerful wizards in Middle-earth, but he volunteered for reasons that he didn't understand. A will not entirely his own, but still he stuck with it to the end, doing his very best and going far beyond his physical limit, his mental limit, his spiritual limit to make the impossible happen. That someone else may have done it better is not relevant, because those characters did not insert themselves into that role, but they had their own, sometimes equally important roles to play. Okay, let's move on to the next question. How do dragons in Tolkien's universe acquire their scales? Do they have them from birth, or do they grow over time like human hair? So Tolkien's dragons do seem to be born without scales, and then later they grow them. Though much of the creation of the dragons and their nature is shrouded in mystery, we do know that the very first dragon to ever exist, Glaurung, at one point did not have scales to protect him. I'm going to read you a section of the Silmarillion here. Again, after 100 years, Glaurung, the first of the Urloki, the fire drakes of the north, issued from Angban's gates by night. He was yet young and scarce half-grown, for long and slow is the life of the dragons. But the elves fled before him to Eredwethin, and to Dorthonion in dismay. And he defiled the fields of Ardgailan. Then Fingon, prince of Hithlum, rode against him with archers on horseback, and hemmed him round with a ring of swift riders, and Glaurung could not endure the darts, being not yet come to his full armoury, and he fled back to Angban, and came not forth again for many years. We don't know at this point how old Glaurung is in this assault, but we don't know the date of his creation. But he is immature at this point and not yet come to his full armory. Dragons normally have armored scales that can withstand arrows, covering most of them, save for their soft underbellies, which in Glaurung's case would not be vulnerable most of the time, except, of course, when he's stretching himself over a gorge to cross a river. The later flying dragons would fly in such a way as to protect their bellies, though Smaug did not care to do this, as he was armored by silver and gold and gems. It is mentioned at the end of that paragraph that he did not come forth for many years, which, considering the elvish nature of the narrative, can mean anything, though in this case it was around 2 centuries before a fully mature Glaurung emerged from Angband. As for how the dragons grow their scales, well, they just do. They grow them as naturally as a part of physical maturity. Like you said, like growing hair. Think of dragons getting their scales like a sort of dragonian puberty. Okay, next question. Our next question came in anonymously. Was Sauron aware of Eru Ilúvatar and his role in the creation of Middle-earth? Of course, Sauron was aware of Ilúvatar and his role in creating not just Middle-earth, but the whole of the world. Sauron was there when it happened. The process of the creation of the world was called Ainulindala, which translates as Music of the Holy Ones. Before there was anything in existence outside of the timeless halls, where Ilúvatar, that's God, and the Ainur, that's the angels, the Ainur would come to Ilúvatar and they would play music for him. They did this in small groups or in singles, but eventually Ilúvatar called them all together for a grand concert. He led them in 3 themes, though Melkor, the most powerful of the angels, sang music that was discordant to the themes of Ilúvatar, thus creating discord and evil. Ilúvatar gave shape to the music, and thus the world was created. The term Ainur here refers to the angels, not merely the Valar. This would include every one of them that would choose to dwell in the world, and those that did not, and among their number was one guy named Mairon, whose name would later be forsaken by the elves, who would only refer to him as Gorthaur or Sauron. Every angel, even the fallen ones like Morgoth, Sauron, Saruman, Gothmog, they all had a part to play in the creation of the universe, and God made sure that a little bit of each of their thoughts was put into creation, and in the case of Morgoth, all of his thoughts. So Sauron is well aware of God and how the universe was created. He was right there helping create the universe with everyone else. Okay, next question. Our next question comes in from the request of Thomas Olson, who asks, what do we know about the land of Khand, which seems to be the furthest point east on the map of Middle-earth? Who lived there, and what was there? We don't know, actually, a lot about Khand. There's not a lot of information here. I'll tell you what I do know. Khand lies southeast of Mordor, and as thus it's not so much considered a country in Hrun, which means the east, but Harad, which is considered the south. There were indigenous people there that were at war with the Wain Riders. When Sauron stepped in and brokered a peace between them, and because he did that, Khand joined Sauron willingly. The warriors from Khand that took part in the War of the Ring were called Variags, and Tolkien never gave us a meaning of the word Variag, but it might have been derived from a Norse word that means mercenary. These men were among Sauron's backup after the death of the Witch King. They were stationed at Osgiliath, and then they were sent to Pelennor by Gothmog, but then were routed by Prince Imrahil and his Swan Knights. Not much is known beyond that. It's never mentioned if Gondor ever found peace with Khand or didn't find peace with Khand. The literary purpose of Khand seems to be just to show that Sauron's influence is over a great many different countries, including by methods other than direct conquering, because he gained Khand as an ally through diplomacy. Sauron was actually capable of diplomacy. So I think that's why it's even on the map, is to sort of demonstrate that there were lands that joined Sauron willingly, not because they were necessarily evil people, but because Sauron did something for them. Okay, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from Evangelos Paschopoulos, I hope I'm saying it right, who asks, did Tolkien ever explain the telepathic link between Frodo and Gandalf? Was it situational, Frodo's location where it occurred because of the One Ring and Narya, or one of Gandalf's powers? So it's definitely the location in this case. Frodo, after putting on the One Ring and escaping from Boromir, he goes off running, and he eventually stops to rest. He's still invisible, he has the ring on, but the place that he decides to sit is a magical spot called the Seat of Seeing, and this is located on Amon Hen, which transliterates as Hill of the Eye, or translated as the Hill of Sight. This is a magical spot where one can sit on the seat and see far. It is unknown if just anyone can sit on the seat and see far in every direction, or if they need to be carrying something magical, such as one of the Palantiri, or in Frodo's case, the One Ring. Wearing the ring on the seat of seeing does get Sauron's attention. He doesn't know that the ring is located there, but something magical is happening that he is drawn to. As Frodo is nearly discovered by Sauron, a voice yells in his head to remove the ring, which he does, severing the connection, which does suggest that a magical artifact is indeed required to use the seat in this sense. The description of Frodo's magical sight also closely matches the description of the Palantiri from Unfinished Tales, suggesting that the seat is indeed connected to them, and may have been used by seers or kings in Gondor to amplify the powers of the Palantiri. The voice is not explicitly stated to be Gandalf, but Gandalf later on, when he speaks to Aragorn and Gimli and Legolas in Fangorn Forest, he strongly suggests that he did use this communication. All beings in Tolkien's universe have telepathic ability, but some can use it better than others. Men, for example, rarely are able to tap into this ability due to the fact that they are mortal incarnates. As the newly reborn Gandalf the White, his powers were greater, and he was able to not only communicate his thought to Frodo, but to do so across a long distance. Okay, let's move on to the next question. The next question comes in from Edward Moulton, who asks, does J.R.R. Tolkien's morality take away from the realism of The Lord of the Rings? Dune and Game of Thrones seem to have a more gray understanding of morality. So, not for the first time, and probably not for the last time, I invoke an episode of a YouTube program called Epic Rap Battles of History, which had J.R.R. Tolkien and George R.R. Martin. And to quote one of Tolkien's bars, it was, "We all know the world is full of chance and anarchy, so yes, it's true to life for characters to die randomly. But newsflash, the genre is called fantasy. It's meant to be unrealistic." And the next line to finish out the rhyme is, "You myopic manatee." Perhaps you want realism and fantasy, or you want gray morality, and that is fine. But in the opinion of myself, and in the opinion of Tolkien himself as well, that kind of defeats the purpose. While this is not true of all of his work, he did consider certain works, such as The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, to be fairy stories. And in his essay on fairy stories, he gives his own definition of what a fairy story is in great detail, but I'm going to give you a relevant excerpt here from the essay on fairy stories. "The realm of fairy story is wide and deep and high and filled with many things. All manner of beasts and birds are found there, shoreless seas and stars uncounted, beauty that is an enchantment, and an ever-present peril, both joy and sorrow, sharp as swords. In that realm a man may, perhaps, count himself fortunate to have wandered, but its very richness and strangeness tie the tongue of the traveler who would report them. And while he is there, it is dangerous for him to ask too many questions, lest the gate should be shut and the keys be lost." And I'm going to give you another quote from Tolkien from Letter 131. And Letter 131 is kind of amazing. If you read any of Tolkien's letters, if you'd read just one of his letters, I'd recommend you read this one, because it's just a font of wisdom and information that I come back to many, many times. When I quote letters, you'll notice I often quote this one. And in this one, he gave his definition of high fantasy. And when he said what high fantasy means, this was the words he used: "Purged of the gross, and fit for the more adult mind of a land now long steeped in poetry." Tolkien, of course, did not live long enough to make any sort of commentary on A Song of Ice and Fire, but he did comment on Dune. And he said he disliked it with some intensity. He did not think that it was bad. It just wasn't for him. it wasn't the type of thing that he liked to read, and it wasn't the type of thing that he liked to write. So really what I'm getting at here is that it's a matter of opinion that drives us to like things or to dislike things. But my own opinion is that asking for realism in fantasy is tearing down the very definition of fantasy, which by its own name suggests a fantastical story, not a political allegory set in a vaguely medieval realm with dragons, because that's what A Song of Ice and Fire is. It's pretty much the Wars of the Roses with dragons. And I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with telling that story. I'm saying that it doesn't conform to the definition of a high fantasy. Dune is science fiction, so that's sort of like a completely different genre. Yes, there's a lot of crossover in writing style, in history and such between science fiction and fantasy, but they're still very different. And I want to highlight a few of the comments I got when I put this on Quora. This is something that VL said. I believe this quote from the Lord of the Rings preface sums it up rather well. As a guide, I had only my own feeling for what is appealing or moving. And for many, the guide was inevitably often at fault. Some who have read the book, or at any rate have reviewed it, have found it boring, absurd, or contemptible. And I have no cause to complain, since I have similar opinions of their works, or of the kinds of writing that they evidently prefer. Also, so, yeah, I'm not going to read that last part. But basically what Tolkien's saying here, and VL, you're very right to point this out, is I wrote this for myself because this is the sort of story that I like, and I hope that you like it. But if you don't, that's okay, because you probably like things that I don't like. It's sort of like saying, yeah, to each their own. Alexander Scott, I want to read his comment. He said, respectfully, I would add that Martin's work isn't really more realistic either. People can't go from one place to the other without a huge number of things going wrong, causing a lot of travel to turn into fiascos akin to a Benny Hill sketch. There are absolutely points in history where travel is full of mischance, but it is not the constant, almost supernaturally consistent folly that is in Martin's works. No one could ever go from point A to point B because Martin leans so far into the quest must not go smoothly aspect of the hero's journey. Thing is, not all travel is a journey, sometimes it's just travel. The sheer amount of complications he introduces stymie the resolution of his work. He has a lot of strengths as a writer that I appreciate, but I can't help but sympathize with fans even more than 15 years ago feared he would never find a satisfying conclusion to his work. I don't think he is going to finish his work, and I don't fault him for not finishing his work. Tolkien didn't finish his work, after all. I've only read a little bit of Martin. The first book, the one that's called The Game of Thrones, and I like Tolkien said of Dune, I like Dune. Tolkien hated Dune. He said he disliked it with some intensity. I disliked A Game of Thrones with some intensity. I found it to be reprehensible. But that doesn't mean that if somebody likes it that I'm going to sort of cast any aspersion on them. I know a lot of people who like his work. I think the idea of it constantly has to go wrong is sort of a very, almost like a gaming sort of thing, where there has to be, random encounters and things to happen along the way. But nary a thought is given to the fact that some of these things can be good, like Frodo and Sam sharing a chicken dinner in Ithilien, for example. And that does seem to go wrong at first. But then it leads to them meeting Faramir, which is a wonderful thing that happens. Let's see. This person's name is redacted, and I don't mean that their name was redacted, but their name literally is redacted. But they left a great quote from C.S. Lewis here, who said, "Since it is so likely that children will meet cruel enemies, let them at least have heard of brave knights and heroic courage. Otherwise, you are making their destiny not brighter, but darker." And that's absolutely wonderful of C.S. Lewis to say. And he's one that, interestingly, I didn't really like his books either. Well, I liked his science fiction, actually. But his fantasy work, I think it started off very strong. But by the time, in the Narnia series, at least, you got to the third book, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, I did not like it. But I think the first one, and to a lesser extent the second one, were pretty good. But as a person, I would say C.S. Lewis was great. And he's absolutely right in that sense. I'm just going to... I'm just going to include one more comment here, if I can find it. Here it is. Roderick Kerr. A lot of people said similar things to Roderick. He's just the one that's closer to the top of the comments here, because I did get a lot of comments on this one. He said, fantasy is not meant to be a depiction of how people behave, but of how they ought to behave. It is how people would behave if they acted from the soul rather than from the ego. Tolkien's work dwells on a plane higher than that of Martin. It is the reason I've read The Lord of the Rings multiple times, but barely made it to the end of Martin's first book before tossing it aside. Too dark. Oh, well, you made it. You said most of the way through a Game of Thrones. I made it. I 2/3 around there, and then I said, no, I don't like this. And why continue something that you're disliking? Just because on the off chance it might get better, that seems masochistic to me. But anyway, we've dwelled on this one long enough. I just wanted to share some of the comments I got there, because there were so many of them were insightful and had good quotes in them. Oh, you know what? Let me give you one more, because it is very short. Rashavia Berman said, one must always remember that George R.R. Martin is not by trade a fantasy writer. He is a horror writer. And from this, I would point out that, and this is interesting, Tolkien wasn't by trade a fantasy writer either. By trade, he was a professor. He was a linguist. He was a philologist. He just happened to write fantasy stories because he enjoyed reading fantasy stories, and he felt that the types of stories that he liked to read weren't being written. All right, let's move on to your next question. Our next question comes in from Brendan, who asks, what was Melkor's unrepeatable masterpiece, as the Silmarils were for Feanor? So before I answer this, I wanted to address the idea of an unrepeatable masterpiece, for anyone who's wondering. When Melkor destroyed the two trees, well, Melkor and Ungoliant destroyed the two trees and cast Valinor and indeed all of the Undying Lands into darkness, the Valar remembered the Silmarils and that the light that made up the two trees was captured within those gems. And they got the idea that if those gems were broken open, the light could be used to revive the trees and sort of resurrect them, to restore them to their glory. So they asked Feanor if he would consider surrendering the gems to be destroyed in this sense for the sake of the two trees and to restore light to Valinor. And he said no, and it didn't matter whether he said yes or no, because the Silmarils were stolen at this point by Melkor, and they were on their way to Middle-earth. But he said no, and the reason that he said was Yavanna had said to him that she couldn't recreate the trees. They were unrepeatable. She could not do such a thing again. And he said it was the same thing for him and the Silmarils. He could not just make more, and they were as dear to him as the trees were to Yavanna. And of course, like the Teleri said, their ships were dear to them, although they could make more ships. I think when they were saying this, they had the agenda of relating to Feanor, so it wasn't really an unrepeatable masterpiece, but it meant a lot to them. So you see these ideas that there are people who are craftsmen who can create something one time and one time only. So for Melkor, Morgoth, it would be the world itself, or at least the world in the state that it became. There's a reason that Arda, the world, is referred to as Morgoth's ring. Sauron allowed the greater part of his power to pass into the One Ring. Melkor did the same thing, but with the world itself. This led to the concept of evil being baked into the world. Essentially, it was Melkor's original sin. Now, before even the world was manifest, God, Ilúvatar, made the distinction that although all of the Ainur who sang the song that made the world would see bits of themselves in it, the world was still mostly Melkor. But his part was still just a part, not the whole. I'm going to read you the relevant section from the Silmarillion. But when they were come into the void, Ilúvatar said to them, Behold your music. And he showed to them a vision, giving to them sight where before was only hearing. And they saw a new world made visible before them, and it was globed amid the void, and it was sustained therein, but was not of it. And as they looked and wondered, this world began to unfold its history, and it seemed to them that it lived and grew. And when the Ainur had gazed for a while, and were silent, Ilúvatar said again, Behold your music. This is your minstrelsy, and each of you shall find contained herein amid the design that I set for you all those things which it may seem that he himself devised or added, and thou, Melkor, We'll discover all the secret thoughts of thy mind, and will perceive that they are but a part of the whole and tributary to its glory. So what he's saying here is that all of the angels put their thoughts into a song, and he took a bit from each of them, but he used all of Melkor's ideas. And you may wonder why, but it was essentially to prove a point that Melkor has no power that does not derive from Ilúvatar, and in his attempt to rebel and to ruin creation, he would only make it better. Later on, Ilúvatar makes a similar point to Ulmo regarding Melkor. I'm going to read you that part now. And Ilúvatar spoke to Ulmo and said, Seest thou not how here in this little realm in the deeps of time Melkor hath made war upon thy province? He hath bethought him of bitter cold immoderate, and yet hath not destroyed the beauty of thy fountains, nor of thy clear pools. Behold the snow and the cunning work of frost. Melkor hath devised heats and fire without restraint, and hath not dried up thy desire to utterly quell the music of the sea. Behold rather the height and glory of the clouds and the ever-changing mists, and listen to the fall of rain upon the earth. And in these clouds thou art drawn nearer to Manwe, my friend, whom thou lovest. Then Ulmo answered truly, Water has become now fairer than my heart imagined. Neither had my secret thought conceived the snowflake, nor in all my music was contained in the falling of rain. I will seek Manwe, that he and I may make melodies for even to thy delight. And Manwe and Ulmo have from the beginning been allied, and in all things have served most faithfully the purpose of Ilúvatar. Every attempt that Melkor has to create something terrible, it leads to something beautiful instead, a lesson that he will have to learn in time. So we could even, credit some of the beauty of the world to Melkor, which I'm sure he would absolutely hate that, because Ulmo comes up with water, and Melkor comes up with, well, I'm going to make it really, really way too cold, or I'm going to make it way too hot. He creates weather, which creates snow and rain and clouds and all these things that we can appreciate. And since Ulmo is the water guy and Manwe is the sky guy, clouds bring them closer together, a brotherly bond. Even though they are not brothers, Manwe has a brother, it's Melkor, go figure. But he still has a strong brotherly bond with Ulmo, more so than he would with his actual brother. And it's because of this rebellion. Everything that Melkor did created something wonderful. He created danger. That leads to courage. He created darkness. It makes us appreciate the light. And the elves prefer nighttime anyway. So, yeah, there you have it. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from the Oski Boski, who asks, shouldn't Eru sink Valinor after elves kind of invaded Middle-earth, as he did with the Numenor? No. No, what? No. Very, very no. Extremely no. The two events are not as similar as you may think. The mortals of Numenor were told specifically that they can sail anywhere they wish, just not to the Undying Lands, of which Valinor is just one country. And Ilúvatar did not immediately step in and take action as soon as Pharazôn landed on Aemon, but rather when Manwe asked him to intervene. With the elves, they were never told that they were forbidden to travel to Middle-earth. As I read that section earlier, they were told, you came freely, you can leave freely. Middle-earth is where they're from. They were invited to live in the Undying Lands because of Melkor's taint upon Middle-earth, and not all of the elves went. The Noldor were exiles not because they went to Middle-earth, but because they took part in a rebellion and they murdered the Falmari and stole their ships. The Undying Lands were subsequently severed from the world in the Akallabeth, making it impossible for anyone but elves and Ainur to travel there from Middle-earth. None but Glorfindel and the wizards came to Middle-earth after this event. But yeah, I mean, I guess it just doesn't sit well with me, the thought that, well, because Pharazôn invaded, he's from Numenor, he's the king of Numenor, and he invaded the Undying Lands, then therefore he gets destroyed and his land gets destroyed, so shouldn't that happen to Valinor? But Valinor wasn't the elves' land. It was Manwë's land, and they were basically invited guests. Ingwion's the prince. Ingwe is the king of all elves, but he is not the king of Valinor. He doesn't even live in Valinor. Yeah, the only elves that lived in Valinor were the Felmari, because they wanted to be close to the two trees, and the sea there was nice. Most of the elves lived in a place called Eldamar. So there you have it. Okay, let's move on to the next question. Here's a question that comes in from Robert Leonard. What are your favorite topics of disagreement between Tolkien scholars? For me, it would be the origins of the orcs, actually. In the film version of The Fellowship of the Ring, Saruman gave a speech about the nature of orcs, stating that they were once elves, twisted and corrupted by the dark powers. He did not mention Morgoth by name, as his name was largely kept out of the films, except for the reference to a Balrog of Morgoth. This is itself a reference to a possible origin that was put in the Silmarillion, where it is mentioned that around the time that several of the primordial elves had gone missing, the orcs started appearing. And it is held by the wise that the missing elves became these first orcs. This leads to a lot of problems. If the first orcs were elves, were they still immortal? It is not in the power of Morgoth to revoke immortality. Only Ilúvatar can do that. And if Ilúvatar did do that, why did he do it? And why was this not mentioned in any of the texts? Are all orcs immortal, or only the first ones? If so, why was the immortality not passed on? What mortal strain was introduced into their blood, as men and dwarves had not yet awoken in the world, to dilute their immortal blood? The question goes into a lot of morality. All orcs are evil from birth? Do they have free will? Do they even have souls? Tolkien himself wrestled with this idea. He created the orcs to be evil foot soldiers that could be mowed down by the heroes, but it didn't jibe with his own morality. The idea that an entire race could be evil was an idea that Tolkien hated. In the reference book Morgoth's Ring, Tolkien goes over various ideas for how the orcs could have come to be. He posits that they could have been corrupted men, fixing some of the issues, but not all of them, and it introduces more issues. It casts the veracity of the Silmarillion itself into question, which was itself an idea that Tolkien played with. The Silmarillion wasn't really true, it was just the way that the elves told the story. Men were not supposed to be around yet. In another version, they were soulless animals, enhanced by necromancy, and they give the impression of having free will, but they don't really have free will. This fixes more issues, but it raises other problems. Normally, having intelligence and speech is the indicator that somebody has a fea, a soul, in Tolkien's work. And while necromancy sort of gets around this, like with the dragons, there are various birds and beasts that have the gift of speech. Do they have souls? And if so, are there animals that have souls and also animals that don't have souls? Manwë noted to Yavanna that spirits would come from the outside and go into the plants and the animals, which accounts for the Ents, for example, but does it account for the beings that would become orcs? There is no consensus, but there are a lot of fanciful theories and spectacular arguments. Some are cordial, some are not so cordial. The fact that Tolkien never decided himself muddies the waters so much, with some insisting that what was written in the Silmarillion is fully canon, and others point out that Tolkien was allowed to change his mind. And I agree with that, actually. The Silmarillion was not finished. It was not published within the lifetime of the author, and thus it can't really be the final... It can be the final word on some matters, but not all matters. And the book's editor, which was Tolkien's own son, even admitted that there were mistakes in the Silmarillion. This, along with the assertion that orcs being derived from elves, being kind of wishy-washy, it is held by the wise, it means that essentially the origins of the orcs is a full mystery, one that will continue arguments on into the future. Now, as a bonus, and I've told this story on YouTube before, there was that story of Tolkien scholars in the Tolkien Society arguing for 6 hours about whether or not Middle-earth has bees. It might be an apocryphal story. It was circulated around Tumblr with no first-hand accounts corroborating it. And I think it is apocryphal, but it is endemic of the sorts of silly spats that people get into. I tend to disbelieve this account and its resolution that Meduseld, which was the dwelling of Theoden, translates to mead hall, which suggests honey, which suggests bees, because the resolution is so much easier than that. Bees are mentioned directly in The Hobbit, and mead was mentioned directly in The Lord of the Rings before that point. And no one in 6 hours brought this up. It's quite silly. But there's always that part of me that thinks, well, maybe because it's so ridiculous, that's true. I have not been party to that argument, but I have been in an equally silly argument about whether elves could have red hair. I was asked about this in a panel discussion, and I stated that I don't see why not. And one of my fellows, it was Sid, argued that elves couldn't possibly have red hair, and I wanted to move things along and not dwell on it at the time, but it was brought up by a viewer that not only were elves with red hair specifically mentioned, but that one of Feanor's sons had a name that directly translates to red-haired. So it does amaze me at how passionately people will defend something that's easily disproven. I love the passion. I just, it's kind of funny sometimes when it's something that easy, like bees or red hair. Anyway, let's move on to the next question. Okay, our next question comes in from Manatee Art, who, that's a great name, who asks, why did Elrond put no charge on any of the Fellowship except Frodo? Why didn't he make them at least pledge, swear, or something to stay with Frodo? Elrond is too wise for something like that. The Fellowship is formed, and they leave on their journey at the start of Book 2. But later in Book 5, we meet the dead men of Dunharrow, also known as the Oathbreakers. They're a cautionary tale about the dangers of taking an oath and then not keeping up your end of it. Due to their broken oath, they are denied the gift of man to pass from the world. And they've been lingering as ghostly figures in Middle-earth for thousands of years. Elrond, though, has intimate knowledge of these two guys. Put a different picture up there. The two adult elves pictured are Mathros and Maglor, and the young boys are Elrond and Elros. They are two sons of Feanor who took an oath that would compel them to kill anyone who kept a Silmaril away from them, which would include both of Elrond's parents. They were also somewhat compelled to kill the young boys as well, but instead abandoned them in a cave until the Silmaril was far away, and they were no longer oath-bound to kill the boys. Mathros and Maglor took in the boys, and they even named them. If they had names given by their parents, it was never mentioned by Tolkien. Mathros and Maglor essentially raised Elrond. He didn't know his parents very well, and he would not get to meet them properly until he sailed to the west, as they had done so, to pray to Manwë to intervene in Middle-earth. And they were spared for breaking the ban of the Valar, but they were no longer allowed to return to Middle-earth and walk among its people. A sort of exception was made for Eärendil, because he fought in the War of Wrath, but he did not walk among the peoples of Middle-earth. He stayed in his flying ship the entire time. Mathros and Maglor were not good people. This is why, when they stole away the Silmarils from Eänwë after the fall of Morgoth, they were burned by them. The Silmarils were hallowed by Varda, and thus such unholy people could not touch them without burning. Regardless, they had a soft side, and raising the boys that were essentially orphans was one of them, one of their soft points. Elrond turned out pretty great, despite being raised by two homicidal maniacs. But he was under no delusions that his adoptive fathers were saints. He was well aware of their tragic lives being a direct consequence of taking an oath in a moment of passion. So if we apply this to the Lord of the Rings, Elrond would never, ever ask someone to partake in an oath that they may not fulfill. Not even Frodo. Remember, Frodo was a volunteer. Besides this point, not all present were planning to go to Mordor. For example, Boromir was not going to go, and Aragorn was going to go with Boromir to Minas Tirith. Circumstances changed. Boromir died. Merry and Pippin got captured. That was a big part of that. And if such an oath was taken, would Merry and Pippin be punished for the act of being captured? Would Gandalf be punished for dying? There are a lot of variables, and the likes of Elrond would know better than to make someone swear to accompany Frodo. Keep in mind that Elrond didn't even want Merry and Pippin to go. He thought that, Gandalf vouched for them, but he really didn't think it was a good idea, because Merry would be best put to use back in the Shire, keeping an eye on things, and Pippin was not even an adult. He was going to send 2 elves in their place, and the only reason that he agreed to Merry and Pippin being in the Fellowship was because they told him, you can't stop us unless you imprison us. And Elrond, of course, wasn't going to do that. So they were going to follow Frodo no matter what. And then they didn't get to go to Mordor with him, even though they didn't swear an oath, but they said they were going to go with Frodo. But they couldn't. They got captured. Things happen, is what I'm saying. Okay, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from Brad Dickerson, who asks, how did the Balrog Gothmog communicate to his soldiers while commanding Morgoth's armies? Speech or telepathy? Speech was not necessary. Now, whether Gothmog could speak or not is an interesting topic. I'm going to get into it a little bit. It's not super relevant. But let's get into a little bit about the nature of Gothmog. He was a Balrog, and therefore he was a Maya spirit, an angel, albeit a fallen one. However, this was not always the case in Tolkien's Legendarium. There was a period of time in the early writings when Balrogs were simply a sort of fire demon, large and powerful monsters that were dangerous but could be slain with some difficulty. These writings were mostly seen in the Book of Lost Tales, and in Part 2, Tur famously killed 5 Balrogs. However, in deciding that the Balrogs are angelic in nature, they became less numerous and far more powerful. And no one has ever killed a Balrog without also dying, even if the kill was one-sided, such as Glorfindel, stabbing one in the stomach with no injury to himself, but the Balrog snagged him by the hair as it fell into a ravine. In the early writings, Gothmog was still the Lord of the Balrogs, but he was not himself a Balrog. In this instance, he was the son of Melko, who was later revised to be Melkor or Morgoth, and his mother was an ogress. Ogres and the idea of the Valar having children were later revised out of Tolkien's works, with the only angel we know of that had a child being the Maya Melian. So there was once an idea that Gothmog himself was not actually a Balrog, he was just their lord. This doesn't carry over to the canon Legendarium, in which there were never more than 7 Balrogs. That being said, at some point Tolkien decided that Balrogs do not speak. Now, whether they can or cannot is not relevant. They don't. Now, I would say that they can't speak. Tolkien's note was that Durin's Bane should not speak, laugh, or make any vocal noise in a proposed animated adaptation of The Lord of the Rings, which never got made, separate, of course, from the Bakshi version that did get made later on. The book, The Lord of the Rings, however, does include this following passage. With a terrible cry, the Balrog fell forward, and its shadow plunged down and vanished. But even as it fell, it swung its whip, and the thongs lashed and curled about the wizard's knees, dragging him to the brink. He staggered and fell, grasped vainly at the stone, and slid into the abyss. Fly, you fools, he cried, and was gone. A terrible cry seems to me to be a vocal sound. Tolkien was not speaking on this, but rather the idea that the Balrog would laugh, and he insisted that it should remain silent. He did write that it cried out as it fell, which to me states that the Balrogs can make vocal sounds. They just generally don't, for whatever reason. Anyway, all of this to say that I find it likely that if Gothmog found it necessary to speak, he could speak. However, speech would be unnecessary. All of Tolkien's creations can communicate without speech. Tolkien's form of telepathy is called asanwe, which translates as exchange of thought. Now, according to the notes where he speaks about this, which are in Palmra Eldalambran, issue 17, and also the book The Nature of Middle-earth, all Ainur and incarnates have this ability, though having a body somewhat dampens the ability. The reason that not everybody is going around using this ability is that it requires one to practice senwe lachya, which essentially means having an open mind. So Gothmog may have spoken, but he didn't need to. He was the big guy in charge. The only being other than Morgoth that was above him in this hierarchy would be Sauron. He did not need to communicate directly to troops any more than a general needs to give orders directly to a private. Orders would filter downwards, and in situations like the fall of Gondolin, which was less of a war and more of a massacre, complex orders were not needed, just probably pointing. He probably did a lot of pointing. All right, let's get on to the last question. Our last question comes in from Link of Wise, who asks, why did Lotho not have any kids? His family, the Sackville-Bagginses, seemed obsessed with Bag End, yet didn't seem to want to establish an actual long-lasting claim to the estate. Wouldn't his mother nag him about that? So, to put it simply, Lotho was unpleasant. Lotho was 55 years old when he was murdered by Grima Wormtongue under the orders of Saruman. He lived in Bag End, and he was not exactly marriage material during his time there. He started buying up lots of property, essentially taking over large portions of the Shire, and eventually overthrew its government. He started the pipeweed trade with Isengard, and he invited ruffians from Isengard to live with him to solidify his power. He banned beer, which is a staple of Hobbit culture, simply because he didn't like it. When Saruman arrived in the Shire, we don't know how long Lotho was still alive before Saruman had him disposed of, but I do wonder if Lotho was around when his mother was imprisoned, and whether or not he even cared. She certainly cared about him. She was utterly broken when she found out that he had been murdered. Lotho's murder wasn't even known in the Shire. They thought he was the boss, while only a select few knew that Sharky, Saruman, was running things in his stead. Frodo points out that even when Lotho thought he was working on his own, he was likely being manipulated by Saruman. But it is worthy of note that while the Shire hobbits cheer Lobelia's release, and she mourns her son, we aren't given any indication that anyone except for her cared about Lotho. What I'm getting at is here, nobody was about to have babies with this guy. And while he was an unpleasant person, Tolkien never gave me the impression that Lotho was so vile to force the issue. Had he lived, perhaps he could have been redeemed as Lobelia was. But even then, the hobbits have a long memory, and I think a survived Lotho would remain a bachelor for life. So anyway, that was our last question. I greatly enjoyed this episode, as I usually do. Sometimes I sit down to record this. It's late on Tuesday night. I've just done a live stream, which means I've been talking for hours already, and I'm pretty tired, and I was like, oh my god, I have to record. And that's like a whole thing. And then I sit down, and I'm like, how am I going to get through this ordeal? And then I start talking, and I love it. And I just start smiling, and I love it. It's one of those things that I think about, like, oh, it's like a chore that I have to do this, that I have to record so late. And then I do it, and I don't regret a single moment of it. If you want to send me some questions, you can ask me questions right there in the comments, or if you want to be featured in a video, or if you feel that the comment section is not really extensive enough for what you want to ask, you can go over to Quora. Quora is a website where you can ask any question and have people with knowledge in the field that you're asking answer the question. If you ask any sort of Tolkien question on there, you're going to be given a list of people that you can request the answer for. My name is going to be, at the top of the list, near the top of the list, somewhere near the top of the list. You'll see my face. It's an old picture of me with my dog, but you'll see me. And my name, of course, John Sierra. You'll see that. And I have a link to my Quora in the description, as well as my Quora group, the Grey Havens, where all of my answers get posted, as well as other people's answers that I enjoy, or are friends or colleagues of mine as well. So, yeah, if you've reached the end of the video, I'm going to ask you to subscribe, because I think if you've gone this far, you pretty much have to subscribe, right? You can't just be like, nah, I watched the whole thing, but I don't want more. That seems weird to me, right? That seems very strange. Of course, I'm kidding, but we're trying to reach 2,000, and like I said, when I started the video, we were just three away. So by the time this goes up, I'm sure we'll have 2,000, and we'll have a little bit of a little celebration here, and I'll let you guys know what the next steps are going to be in terms of doing more stuff on the channel and growing it a little bit. There are other things that I want to do on the channel that I've sort of put on hold for a little while because I've just gotten busy, but I will be returning to them as well. So if you're missing like the Hobbit playthrough that's coming back. Reactions to Rankin Bass Hobbit. I did one episode of that. I will do another episode of it. I will be reacting to a lot of different Tolkien stuff as well. It's just I haven't had the chance. It's just been very busy on my end. But we're going to get to those things. Absolutely 100%. That being said, if you want to do something more than subscribe and really, really help me out here, consider membership. It is a paid subscription. It's like $5 a month. It's not very expensive at all. There's a join button. The join button might not work. Some people have told me I've tried to join it. It didn't work. All you got to do is there's a link right in the description. It might actually be the very first thing in the description. That one will work. The people who've told me that the join button doesn't work have tried that, and then it does work. You get some emotes, and you get to see all the videos at least a week early, sometimes even earlier than that. So I will see you guys next week.